Freaking fruit flies are everywhere. Welcome to the Visual Center. I'm Josh, and it's here we talk all about photography and visual art. Today I'll be talking about 35mm film, some cameras I recommend, and some films I recommend when you're starting out. When you go into your local camera shop or online to buy film, you're going to notice there's a lot of different options, and it's going to be a little overwhelming when you're first starting out. So today I'm going to talk about the 7 films that I like the most and what it is that I like about them. So let's go ahead and get rid of these. The 7 films I want to talk about include 3 black and white options and 4 color negative options. We can talk about slide film in a different video. The first black and white film we'll talk about is Kodak Tri-X or TX400. It's a 400 ISO film that has a beautiful grain structure and a wide range of tones that will give you a beautiful black and white image. It's also a very forgiving film and can handle a little bit of under and overexposure. One of my favorite things about this film is its versatility. Its ISO can be expanded anywhere from 100 ISO all the way up to 6400 ISO, which can make it great for portraits, studio work, street photography, or pretty much anything in between. The next film is Ilford HP5. HP5 is also a 400 ISO film, and it shares a lot of the capabilities of the Tri-X 400. The biggest difference for me is the different grain structure as you zoom in on the image, and it does have a little bit more of a silvery quality, which is a little bit hard to explain. HP5 is a great film to start with because it's a little more affordable than some of the other black and white films. The last black and white film I want to talk about is Ilford XP2. XP2 is also a 400 ISO film, but it's unique in that it's processed in C41 chemicals, which are the same chemicals that color negative films are processed, which means you can get it developed at pretty much any lab all across the world. It has a beautiful range of tones and amazing contrast. The first 2 color films I want to talk about are Portra 160 and Portra 400. Now, as the name implies, these are formulated to produce a good range of colors for skin tones and portraits. They're also a good all-around film to produce neutral colors for studio work or even landscape photography. I personally use Portra 160 for travel photography and portraits, and I use Portra 400 for nighttime scenes and indoor photography. Both of these films have an amazing range of tones and latitude, and you can get different looks and colors out of them depending on how you expose them, which makes them an extremely versatile film. The next color film is Kodak Ektar 100. Ektar is an extremely fine-grained 100 ISO speed film that produces vivid colors, which makes it a great film for landscape and travel photography. Though it can yield good results for portraits, it can also tend to be a little contrasty and put red into skin tones that aren't always wanted. Because it's a 100 ISO film, be sure you have plenty of light or make sure to carry around a tripod if you need it. Last but not least is Kodak Gold 200. Gold 200 is what's called a consumer film, which means it has less silvers and dyes in it, which make it more affordable. But don't be fooled, just because it's cheaper than professional films doesn't mean you won't get good results. Gold 200 is one of my favorite films for general use photography, and I even like to use it for portraits. It has amazing neutral colors and a decent grain structure. The only thing to watch out for is it can get a little bit grainy, so make sure to find some great light to use it in. Now, finding a 35mm camera can also be overwhelming, but I have a few suggestions for that as well. The first camera I always recommend to beginners is the Canon AE1 or AE1 Program. These cameras are easy to find, they're built like a tank, the controls are super simple, and just about any lens you find for them is going to be a great lens. The lens I recommend starting with is a 50mm 1.4. It's a great lens that can give you shallow depth of field for portraits, and it's wide enough that you could also shoot landscapes with it. Now, the next camera I recommend is this Nikon F3. Now, pretty much any Nikon camera that you find is going to be a great camera to use, and there's not very many Nikon lenses that I wouldn't recommend. One of the coolest things about Nikon is they've had the same lens mount since the 50s, so you can use any lens back from then all the way to modern lenses on the same body. The Nikons are going to be a little more expensive than the Canons, but they're built even better than them, so they'll last you forever. If you can find a Nikon from the late 80s or 90s, they'll even have modern metering systems, which will help you get better exposures. Now, this last manual focus camera I have is something completely different, which is called a rangefinder. These other two cameras are SLR cameras, which both have a lens that needs to get out of the way so you can take the photo. A rangefinder does not have a mirror, and it's actually what modern mirrorless cameras are modeled after. If you've ever heard of the brand Leica, those are the most popular rangefinders around, but they're also the most expensive cameras out there. Since a rangefinder doesn't have a mirror, the way it works is there's a window in the back that you look through, and as you look through it, you will see two dots, and within those dots you will see whatever subject you're pointing at as a mirrored image. Those images will merge, and as soon as they become one image, it means you're in focus. One cool thing about rangefinders, since the window is clear over to the side, you can actually have both eyes open and be able to watch your subject, which makes it amazing for street photography. Now there's two affordable rangefinders that I recommend, one being the Canon QL17 Canonet, and the other being this Yashica Electro 35 GSN. The Canonet is a very small, lightweight camera, and it has an amazingly sharp lens. It also has fully manual operations, whereas this Yashica is aperture priority only, which means you select the ISO and the aperture, and the camera selects the shutter speed for you, which can be great in some situations, but often you'd like to be able to choose the shutter speed as well. Now when you're looking for a manual focus camera, there are way too many options out there, but I would mainly stick to Canon, Nikon, Olympus, and Minolta brand cameras. Now if you're wanting an autofocus 35mm camera, I have a few suggestions as well. Now as I've said in my previous video, the best part about these autofocus SLRs is they have the same lens mount as the cameras you might already have, which means if you already have a Canon or Nikon setup, you can use your same lenses and get awesome results. As far as Nikon goes, this N80 is an amazing camera. It has a modern metering system and many of the same functions as a modern DSLR. The reason I love this camera is because of how lightweight it is and because of its size. But the reason it's so lightweight is because it's made out of plastic. So if you want a more hefty and more professional camera, I would suggest the Nikon F100 or the Nikon F4. If you don't already have lenses, I would suggest this 51.8D model. It's fast focusing and you can pick one up for around 50 bucks. Moving on to the Canon side of things, I would suggest something like this Canon EOS Elan 7E. Now this will have the same functionality as the Nikon, meaning you can use any of your modern lenses you have as long as they cover full frame. And again, if you don't have a lens, I would suggest starting with a 51.8. The downfall again with this Elan 7 is it is a bit plasticky, so if you want a more professional model, I would suggest getting the Canon EOS 3. Now another option if you want autofocus is a point and shoot camera like this Konica Big Mini. Point and shoot cameras are some of the most fun cameras to shoot with because they fit in your pocket, they can go anywhere with you, and they hardly weigh anything. Now there are tons of point and shoot cameras out there, but I would avoid anything that has a zoom lens on it and stick with cameras that have a fixed focal length lens. The best point and shoot cameras out there usually have 35mm lenses with either an f3.5 or an f2.8 aperture. One thing you want to watch out for with point and shoot cameras is they can often have a date stamped on the image when you take a photo. So I would suggest downloading the camera's specific manual and figuring out how to turn that function off so you don't have a weird date stamp at the bottom of your image when you get your scans back from the lab. Now let's get into how to load all these cameras with film and some of the basic things you'll want to do to set up before you start shooting. Now there are basically only two different loading mechanisms in 35mm cameras. Almost all manual focus cameras have the same way of loading, and almost all autofocus cameras have the same way of loading. Let's start with how to load a manual focus camera. Almost all manual focus cameras will have this little knob, which is actually for rewinding film, as well as opening the film door. On this particular Nikon camera, it has a locking mechanism, which you have to push down, and you just pull up on the rewind knob to open the camera. Once you pull up on the rewind knob, you open the film door, place your film on the left side, then pull the tab all the way over to the right, and on this little take-up spool right here, there will be a little slot that you put the skinny end of the film inside of. And once it's down in there, you can wind it with the lever and it should catch. And if you can see your film tab right there, then you know you've done it right and you can close the film door Then you push down the rewind knob again so it's back in its normal place. Then you may have to release the shutter and wind the film a couple of times, and you're ready to shoot. Now for the autofocus cameras, it's much more simple because the camera does most of the work for you. All you have to do is open the film door, place your film in the left side, pull the tab over so the skinny side goes all the way to the right and down in that slot. Then you just close the film door and the camera takes it to exposure number 1 for you. The last thing I'll talk about is a basic rule of thumb as to how to get your camera set up to allow you to make good exposures with the camera's internal light meter. Now the film I just put in is Tri-X 400, which is a 400 ISO film. So what you typically want to do is set your light meter to 400 ISO so it knows how to meter. But with negative film like this and color negative film, you want to err on the side of overexposing. So I always set my meter 1 stop lower than it needs to be. So for this film, I would set it at 200 instead of 400. On this particular camera, the way you set up your ISO is you pull up on this little knob, and since I want it to be set at 200, I'll move this little knob right to 200. And now my camera should be set up to do 1 stop of overexposure, which will help my images to not be quite as grainy. And with color film, it will give me a slightly more saturated image. So that's the basics you need to know to start shooting 35mm photography. If you have a particular film you want to know more about, or a camera that you'd like help setting up, just let me know down in the comments. I'll be sure to answer you. If you liked this video, be sure to check out the other videos on our channel, and make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell for notifications, and we'll see you in the next video.